The tractor's diesel growl cut through the dawn as the lioness spread her massive frame across the freshly turned earth, her golden eyes locked onto the farmer's trembling hands on the wheel. Before we begin, drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're tuning in from, and hit subscribe so you don't miss stories like this. The sun had barely stretched its fingers over the flat Kansas plains when Jake Carter fired up his old John Deere, the same one his daddy had bought back in 1998. The fields needed plowing before the rain came. Forecasters on the Wichita News had promised a storm by noon, and Jake wasn't about to let another season slip through his fingers. He adjusted his worn-out Stetson, the brim frayed from years of sweat and sun, and eased the tractor forward. The blades bit into the soil, sending up a cloud of dust that stung his eyes. Then he saw her. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow where there shouldn't be one. But as the tractor lurched forward, the shadow resolved into the unmistakable shape of a lioness, her tawny coat dusted with the same red earth she now refused to leave. She wasn't charging, she wasn't snarling. She simply lay there, her chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths, as if the very ground beneath her was the only thing keeping her alive. Jake slammed on the brakes, the tractor shuddering to a stop. His heart hammered against his ribs. Lions didn't belong in Kansas, not in the wild, not in captivity, not anywhere within 1,000 miles. He killed the engine, the sudden silence pressing against his eardrums. The lioness didn't move. Her ears twitched once, twice, as if she'd heard him but couldn't be bothered to react. Jake's mind raced. Maybe it was a prank, some city slicker's idea of a joke, renting an exotic animal to scare the locals. But the way she carried herself, the way her muscles rippled beneath her fur, even in stillness, told him this was no trained circus act. This was a wild thing, and wild things didn't just show up on a farmer's land without a reason. He reached for his phone, fingers slipping on the cracked screen. The signal was weak out here, just one bar flickering in the corner. He dialed the sheriff's office, but the call dropped before it even rang. Cursing under his breath, he tried again. This time it connected. "Sheriff's office," came the gruff voice of Deputy Rick Malone, a man who'd been on the force since Jake was in diapers. "This better be good, Carter. I was in the middle of my coffee." "Rick, you're not going to believe this," Jake said, his voice tighter than a barbed wire fence. "There's a lioness lying in the middle of my south field, just lying there. Won't move." There was a beat of silence, then a snort. "You been hitting the early whiskey again, Jake?" "Ooh, wish I had," Jake muttered. He lowered the phone and snapped a photo, the flash illuminating the lioness's face for a split second. Her eyes gleamed back at him, not with aggression, but with something deeper, something like exhaustion or grief. He sent the photo to Rick, his hands shaking. "Check your messages." Another pause. Then the sound of Rick choking on his coffee. "Son of a... Okay, I'm on my way. But Jake, don't you dare go near that thing, and keep your damn dog inside." Jake glanced toward the farmhouse, where his old border collie, Duke, was already barking up a storm from the porch. He'd have to tie him up. The last thing he needed was Duke charging at a lioness and ending up as breakfast. But as he turned back to the field, he noticed something else. The lioness wasn't alone. Crouched a few feet behind her, half hidden in the tall grass, were two tiny cubs. Their fur was still damp, their eyes wide and curious. They hadn't moved an inch since Jake had spotted their mother. They were watching him, their small bodies trembling. And then it hit him like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just lying there, she was guarding them. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He'd heard stories, of course, whispers about a traveling circus that had passed through Topeka a few weeks back, rumors of a big cat escape. But no one had taken it seriously, until now. The circus folks had packed up and left in the dead of night, owing half the town money. If this lioness had come from there, she'd traveled at least 50 miles to get here. 50 miles, with two cubs in tow, and she'd chosen his field to make her stand. But why? The question gnawed at him as he waited for Rick to arrive. He kept his distance, leaning against the tractor's tire, his rifle slung over his shoulder just in case. The lioness didn't so much as flick her tail in his direction. It was as if she knew he wasn't a threat, or as if she was too tired to care. The cubs, though, were a different story. They inched closer to their mother, their tiny paws pressing into the dirt. One of them let out a soft, questioning chirp. The lioness lifted her head just enough to nudge it gently with her nose, then settled back down, her gaze never leaving Jake. 20 minutes later, Rick's cruiser came barreling down the dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust. He skidded to a stop beside Jake's truck, his door flying open before the car had even fully stopped. "You weren't kidding," he muttered, his hand resting on the butt of his service pistol. "What in the hell is she doing here?" "I don't know," Jake said. "But look." He pointed toward the cubs. Rick's eyes widened. "Well, I'll be damned." The two men stood there, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. This wasn't just a loose animal. This was a mother protecting her young, and she'd picked Jake's land to do it. Rick pulled out his radio, barking orders into it. Animal control, the state wildlife department, maybe even the feds. But Jake knew how these things worked. By the time anyone showed up, it'd be too late. The storm was coming, and if the lioness didn't move, she and her cubs would be sitting ducks. "She's not gonna leave," Jake said quietly. "Not with the cubs there." Rick wiped the sweat from his brow. "Then we gotta make her leave. Can't have a lioness setting up shop in the middle of farm country." Jake shook his head. "You try to force her, she'll fight. And those cubs, they won't stand a chance." Rick sighed, rubbing his temples. "So what do you suggest, Jake? We just let her stay?" Jake didn't answer right away. He looked at the lioness, at the way her sides rose and fell with each breath, at the cubs huddled close to her. There was something in her eyes, something that reminded him of the way his own mama had looked at him the day his daddy died. A mix of defiance and desperation. Like she was saying, "This is my line in the sand." Then it hit him. The field, the freshly turned earth, the way she'd positioned herself right in the middle of it. Jake's stomach twisted. He'd plowed this field a dozen times before, but never like this. Never with the blade set so deep, and never in this particular spot. He crouched down, squinting at the soil. There, half buried in the dirt, was something that didn't belong. A glint of metal. Jake's pulse quickened. He took a step forward, then stopped. The lioness's ears twitched, her muscles tensing. She wasn't going to let him get any closer. "Rick," Jake said, his voice low, "I think I know why she's here." Rick followed his gaze to the spot in the dirt. "What is it?" Jake swallowed hard. I think there's something buried here, something she's trying to protect." Rick's eyebrows shot up. "You think she's guarding a treasure?" Jake shook his head. "Not treasure, something else." He thought back to the stories his granddaddy used to tell, tales of the old-timers who'd settled this land, of the things they'd buried to keep them safe, or to keep them hidden. "My granddaddy always said this land had secrets, said the first carters buried something out here when they staked their claim." Rick let out a low whistle. "You think she smells it?" Jake nodded. "Animals got a sense for that kind of thing. If there's something down there, she knows it, and she's not letting anyone near it." Rick scratched his chin. "Well, we can't exactly dig it up with a lioness sitting on top of it." Jake's mind raced. There had to be a way. The storm was coming, and if they didn't act fast, the rain would turn the field into a mud pit, making it impossible to dig. But the lioness wasn't going anywhere, not with her cubs there, and not with whatever was buried beneath her. Then an idea struck him, a crazy, reckless idea. But it might just work. "Rick," he said, "what if we don't make her leave?" Rick blinked. "Come again?" Jake gestured to the tractor. "What if we move her? Not force her, but give her a reason to go." Rick's expression was skeptical. "And how do you propose we do that?" Jake took a deep breath. We dig up whatever's buried here, but we do it slow, real slow, and we let her see that we're not a threat, that we're not taking it for ourselves. Rick stared at him like he'd lost his mind. You want to dig up a mystery with a lioness watching our every move? Jake nodded. I do. Because whatever's down there, she thinks it's hers, and if we take it without her knowing what we're doing... He trailed off, the implications hanging in the air. Rick sighed, rubbing his face. You're out of your damn mind, Carter, but fine. We'll try it your way, but if she so much as licks her lips in our direction, I'm putting a bullet in her. Jake's stomach churned at the thought, but he nodded. He knew Rick well enough to know the man wouldn't shoot unless he had to, and Jake was determined to make sure it didn't come to that. They got to work. Jake fired up the tractor again, but this time he didn't engage the plow. Instead, he backed it up, positioning it so the bucket was just a few feet from where the lioness lay. She watched him, her eyes narrow, but she didn't move. The cubs, however, scurried behind her, pressing their small bodies against her legs. Jake climbed down from the tractor, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. He grabbed a shovel from the back of his truck and handed it to Rick. You start. I'll keep an eye on her. Rick took the shovel, his grip tight. This is the dumbest thing I've ever done. Second dumbest, Jake corrected. The dumbest was the time you tried to ride that wild Mustang bareback. Rick shot him a glare, but there was a hint of a smile on his face. Shut up and watch the lion. Jake did. He watched as Rick drove the shovel into the earth, the blade biting into the dirt with a dull thunk. The lioness's ears twitched, but she didn't move. Rick dug again, deeper this time. The soil was loose from the plowing, and it didn't take long before the hole was knee-deep. Then Rick's shovel hit something solid. A metallic clang echoed across the field. Jake's breath caught in his throat. That's it. Rick wiped the sweat from his brow and crouched down, brushing away the dirt with his hands. A corner of something metal glinted in the sunlight. He dug faster now, his movements urgent. The lioness let out a low growl, her tail flicking back and forth. Jake's heart pounded. Easy, Rick. Easy. Rick slowed his movements, his hands working carefully. The dirt flew, and soon the shape became clear. A box, a large, iron-bound chest, its surface rusted from decades underground. Rick let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned. Jake's mind raced. This had to be what the lioness was guarding. But why? What was so important about an old chest that a wild animal would risk everything to protect it? Rick reached down and grabbed the handle, giving it a tug. The chest didn't budge. It's locked, he muttered. He tried again, putting his back into it. The chest groaned, but the lock held. Rick cursed under his breath. We're gonna need the bolt cutters from my cruiser. Jake nodded, but his eyes were fixed on the lioness. She hadn't moved, but her body was tense, her muscles coiled like a spring. She was watching the chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. And then, as if sensing his thoughts, she let out a soft, rumbling purr. Not a growl, not a threat, a sound of approval. Jake's breath hitched. It was as if she wanted them to open it. Rick jogged back to his cruiser, returning a minute later with a pair of bolt cutters. He knelt down, positioning the jaws around the lock. With a grunt, he squeezed the handles together. The lock snapped with a sharp crack. Rick lifted the lid, and a cloud of dust billowed out, swirling in the morning air. Jake stepped forward, his curiosity getting the better of him. Inside the chest were stacks of yellowed papers tied together with faded red ribbon. And beneath them, nestled in the velvet lining, was a small, leather-bound journal. Jake reached in, his fingers brushing against the cover. The leather was worn, the edges frayed. He pulled it out, flipping it open to the first page. The handwriting was elegant, the ink faded but still legible. Property of Eleanor Carter, June the 12th, 1893. Jake's blood ran cold. Eleanor Carter, his great-great-grandmother. The woman who'd founded the Carter farm with her husband Thomas, back when Kansas was still wild and untamed. He'd heard the stories, how she'd been a school teacher before she married, how she'd kept a journal of her life on the frontier, but no one had ever found it. Until now. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the words. It was a record of her life, her hopes, her fears, the struggles of building a home in a land that wanted to swallow them whole. And then, toward the end, he found it, a passage that made his hands tremble. June the 20th, 1898. The Lioness came to us today. She was wounded, her side torn open by a hunter's bullet. Thomas wanted to drive her off, but I couldn't let him. There was something in her eyes, something wild and free, but also lost, like she'd lost everything. And then I saw them, her cubs, two tiny things, no bigger than kittens, hiding in the tall grass. She'd brought them to us for safety. And so, we took them in. We built a den for them in the barn, and for the next 3 months they were ours. But a lioness is not meant to be caged, and so when she was healed, we let her go. But not before she left us a gift, a promise. She pressed her forehead to mine, and I swear I understood her. She was thanking us, and she was telling us that if we ever needed her, she would come. Jake's hands shook as he read the words. This wasn't just a journal, it was a covenant. A promise passed down through generations, and the lioness lying in his field, she was a descendant of the one his great-great-grandmother had saved. Rick leaned over his shoulder, his eyes wide. What in the hell? Jake didn't answer. He was too busy flipping to the last page. There, in Eleanor's looping script, were the words that made everything click. If ever a Carter should need her, she will return, and she will bring her young, for the debt of kindness is never forgotten. Jake's throat tightened. The lioness hadn't just shown up by accident. She'd come because she remembered. Because somewhere, deep in her blood, she carried the memory of the kindness his family had shown hers over a century ago. And now she was repaying that debt. But why? Why now? He looked up, his gaze locking onto the lioness. She was watching him, her golden eyes unblinking. And then, as if she could sense his confusion, she let out a soft chuff and nodded her head toward the cubs. Jake's breath caught. The cubs. They weren't just her young. They were his responsibility now. Rick must have seen the realization dawn on Jake's face. You're not thinking what I think you're thinking, are you? Jake swallowed hard. I think she wants us to take them. Rick's jaw dropped. Take them? Jake, those are lion cubs. We can, Jake interrupted. And we have to. He gestured to the journal. This isn't just some random lioness, Rick. She's family. And those cubs, they're part of our legacy now. Rick stared at him like he'd lost his mind. And maybe he had, but Jake knew deep in his bones that this was right. The lioness had come to him for a reason, and that reason was sitting right there in the dirt, watching him with wide, curious eyes. But there was still one problem, the storm. The dark clouds on the horizon were getting closer, and the wind had picked up, whipping the tall grass into a frenzy. If they didn't get the cubs to safety soon, they'd be caught in the open when the rain hit. Jake made a decision. Rick, I need you to call animal control. Tell them we've got a situation, but... He hesitated. Tell them we've got it under control, that we don't need them to tranquilize her or anything. Rick raised an eyebrow. And what are you gonna do? Jake took a deep breath. I'm gonna talk to her. Rick's expression was a mix of disbelief and concern. Jake, you can't talk to a lioness. I don't mean with words, Jake said. He stepped forward, his heart pounding. The lioness's ears twitched, her body tensing. Jake crouched down, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He held out his hand, palm up, the way his granddaddy had taught him to approach a skittish horse. "Easy, girl," he murmured. "We're not gonna hurt you." The lioness let out a low growl, but she didn't move. Jake inched closer, his hand still outstretched. "I know you're scared, but your babies, they need help, and we can give it to them." He gestured to the cubs, who were now peeking out from behind their mother, their tiny noses twitching. "Let us take care of them, just for a little while, until the storm passes." The lioness's growl softened into a rumble. Jake held his breath, and then, slowly, she shifted her weight, moving just enough to give him a clear path to the cubs. Jake's heart leapt. She was letting him. He turned to Rick. "Grab the blanket from my truck, the old wool one." Rick didn't question him. He just ran to Jake's truck, returning a moment later with the faded red blanket Jake kept for emergencies. Jake took it, spreading it out on the ground beside the cubs. Then, with painstaking slowness, he reached for the first cub. The little thing let out a tiny meep of protest, but it didn't run. Jake scooped it up, cradling it against his chest. It was warm, its tiny heart beating rapidly against his palm. The lioness watched, her eyes never leaving Jake's face. He placed the cub on the blanket, then reached for the second. This one was bolder, sniffing at Jake's fingers before allowing itself to be lifted. Jake set it down beside its sibling, then carefully wrapped the blanket around them both. The cubs squirmed, but they didn't try to escape. Jake stood, the bundle of blanket and cubs cradled in his arms. The lioness let out a soft chuff. Then, to Jake's astonishment, she stood as well. She stretched, her muscles rippling beneath her fur, then gave Jake one last long look before turning and padding toward the tree line at the edge of the field. Jake's throat tightened. She was leaving, but not before making sure her cubs were safe. Rick let out a low whistle. "I'll be damned," she just handed them over. Jake nodded, his eyes stinging. "She trusted us." The lioness reached the trees, then paused, looking back one last time. Jake lifted the blanket slightly, showing her the cubs were safe. She dipped her head in what looked like a nod, then disappeared into the woods. The moment she was out of sight, the first fat raindrops began to fall. Jake and Rick exchanged a glance, then sprinted for Jake's truck. They piled in just as the sky opened up, the rain coming down in sheets. Jake set the blanket-wrapped cubs on the seat beside him. They peeked out, their wide eyes taking in the strange new world around them. Rick started the engine, the windshield wipers squeaking as they fought against the downpour. "So," he said, his voice careful. "What now?" Jake looked at the cubs, then at the journal still clutched in his hand. "Now we honor the promise." Over the next few weeks, Jake's farm became the talk of the county. News of the lioness and her cubs spread like wildfire, and before long, reporters from as far away as Kansas City were camping out on Jake's doorstep, begging for a story. But Jake kept his mouth shut. He knew the truth, knew that the lioness had come to him for a reason, and that reason was bigger than any headline. The cubs, whom Jake had named Hope and Faith, thrived under his care. He built them a den in the barn, just like his great-great-grandmother had done over a century before. He fed them a diet of raw meat and vitamins, and slowly but surely they grew stronger. And every night, without fail, Jake would sit outside their den and read to them from Eleanor's journal. It was silly, maybe, but it felt right. Meanwhile, Jake dug deeper into the journal, searching for clues about what had brought the lioness to his field that day. And then, one evening, he found it. A passage tucked away near the end, written in a shaky hand, that suggested Eleanor had been old when she'd penned it. "If ever the line of Carter should falter, if ever the land should call for its debt to be repaid, the lioness will return, and she will bring with her the future of our blood. For the circle of life is unbroken, and the kindness of one generation is the salvation of the next." Jake's hands trembled as he read the words. The lioness hadn't just come to repay a debt. She'd come because the land had called her. And the land was in trouble. He thought back to the past few months, the drought that had parched the fields, the bank notices piling up on his kitchen table, the way his neighbors had started to look at him with pity in their eyes, like he was just another farmer who couldn't hack it. Jake had been on the verge of losing everything, and then the Lioness had appeared. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a sign. Jake spent the next few days poring over old maps and deeds, trying to piece together the puzzle. And then he found it. A clause buried in the original land grant for the Carter farm, written in legalese so dense it was almost impenetrable. But the gist was clear. The land couldn't be sold, not without the consent of the guardian of the bloodline. Jake's blood ran cold. The guardian of the bloodline, the Lioness. The bank had been breathing down his neck, threatening to foreclose if he didn't come up with the back payments by the end of the month. But if the land couldn't be sold without the guardian's consent, then the bank couldn't take it. Not legally. Jake's mind raced. This changed everything. But how was he supposed to prove it? The journal was a start, but it wasn't exactly a legally binding document. He needed something more, something undeniable. And then it hit him. The chest, the iron-bound chest they'd dug up that day. There had been more in there than just the journal. Beneath the papers, at the very bottom, had been a small velvet pouch. Jake had almost forgotten about it in the excitement of finding the journal, but now he remembered, and he knew what he had to do. He waited until nightfall, when the house was quiet and the cubs were asleep in their den. Then he crept into the barn, where the chest still sat, half buried in a pile of old tools. He pried it open, his heart pounding, and reached for the pouch. It was heavier than he remembered. He untied the drawstring and upended it into his palm. A key. An old tarnished brass key, its bow shaped like a lion's head, and attached to it a small handwritten note. Jake unfolded it, his hands shaking. For the day, the debt must be repaid. The key to the heart of the land. Use it wisely. Jake's breath caught. The key to the heart of the land. He turned it over in his fingers, his mind racing. There was only one place it could fit. The old well. The one his granddaddy had sealed up years ago, saying it was too dangerous to keep open. But Jake had always wondered why. Now he thought he knew. The next morning, Jake drove out to the well, the key burning a hole in his pocket. The well was at the far edge of the property, near the creek that marked the boundary between his land and his neighbors. It was overgrown with weeds, the wooden cover rotted and half collapsed. Jake pried it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the well was dark and foreboding, the water far below glinting in the dim light. He took a deep breath, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the key. There, set into the stone rim of the well, was a small, almost invisible keyhole. Jake's heart pounded as he fitted the key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying click, and a section of the stone rim swung inward, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a single rolled-up parchment. Jake pulled it out, unrolling it carefully. It was a deed. The original deed to the Carter land, signed by the governor of Kansas himself. And at the bottom, in bold, unmistakable letters, was a clause that made Jake's knees weak. This land, and all that stands upon it, is hereby granted to Thomas and Eleanor Carter and their descendants in perpetuity, so long as the bloodline of the guardian remains unbroken. Should the guardian's line falter, the land shall revert to the state, and no claim of ownership shall stand. Jake's hands trembled. This was it, the proof he needed. The Lioness was the guardian, and her cubs. They were the future of the bloodline. As long as they were on the land, the bank couldn't touch it. But there was a problem. The deed was old, really old, and the state of Kansas wasn't exactly known for honoring century-old clauses written in flowery language. Jake needed more than just the deed. He needed proof that the lioness and her cubs were the guardians, and he needed it fast. The bank was coming to inspect the property in 3 days. Jake spent the next 48 hours in a frenzy of activity. He called in every favor he was owed, from the old vet in town who'd treated Duke's hip dysplasia to the librarian who'd helped him research the history of the farm. He gathered photographs, witness statements, even a sample of the lioness's fur that he'd found snagged on the fence. And then he did the unthinkable. He called the press. The story broke the next morning. Local farmer claims Lioness is legal guardian of his land. The headlines were sensational, the coverage relentless. Reporters camped out on Jake's lawn, cameras flashing as he tried to go about his business. But Jake didn't care, because the story wasn't just about him. It was about the lioness, about hope and faith, about the debt that had been repaid after more than 100 years. And then, the day before the bank was set to arrive, the unthinkable happened. The lioness returned. Jake was in the barn feeding the cubs when he heard the commotion outside. He stepped out to see the lioness standing at the edge of the field, her golden eyes fixed on the farmhouse. The cubs, sensing her presence, let out excited chirps and scrambled toward the door. Jake's heart leapt. She'd come back for them. But there was something different about her this time. She wasn't alone. Standing beside her, their coats still damp from the creek, were 2 more lionesses. Their eyes were just as sharp, just as knowing, and they were watching Jake with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Jake's breath caught. These weren't just any lionesses. These were her sisters. And they'd come to help. The bank representatives arrived the next morning, their suits crisp and their expressions smug. They'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the county had. But they didn't believe a word of it until they saw the lionesses for themselves. There, lounging in the shade of the barn, were the lioness and her 2 sisters, their cubs playing at their feet. The banker's jaws dropped. One of them actually took a step back, his face pale. Jake stepped forward, the original deed in his hand. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady, "I believe you'll find everything in order." The lead banker, a man named Harris with a permanent scowl, cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, we appreciate the unique situation, but a deed is a deed, and yours is over a century old." Jake smiled. "Then I suggest you read the fine print." He handed over the deed, along with the journal and the photographs. Harris's eyes scanned the document, his expression growing more and more uneasy. Then he looked up, his gaze flicking between Jake and the lionesses. "This is absurd," he muttered. "You can't seriously expect us to believe that they are the legal guardians of this land." Jake crossed his arms. "I don't expect you to believe it. I expect you to honor it. That deed is legally binding, and unless you want to explain to your bosses why you ignored a clause that's been on the books since 1898, I suggest you walk away." Harris's face darkened, but Jake could see the calculation in his eyes. The bank didn't want a scandal, and they definitely didn't want to go up against a story that had already captured the hearts of half the country. With a grunt, Harris handed the deed back to Jake. "This isn't over," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. Jake took the deed, his heart pounding. "Yes," he said softly, "it is." The bankers left shortly after, their tails between their legs, and as their car disappeared down the dirt road, Jake let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for years. It was over. The farm was safe, but the story wasn't. That night, as Jake sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the lioness approached him. She moved silently, her paws making no sound on the wooden planks. Jake didn't flinch. He knew she wouldn't hurt him. She stopped a few feet away, her golden eyes fixed on his. Then slowly she lowered her head, pressing her forehead against his. Jake's breath caught. It was the same gesture Eleanor had described in her journal, a gesture of trust, of gratitude. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. And then, with one last look at the cubs playing in the yard, she turned and padded away, her sisters falling into step beside her. Jake watched as they disappeared into the tall grass, their forms melting into the twilight. They were leaving, but Jake knew they'd be back, because the debt wasn't just repaid, it was ongoing. And as long as the Carter bloodline endured, so would the bond between them and the Lionesses. Jake leaned back in his chair, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The farm was safe, the cubs were thriving, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like the future was bright. But there was one last thing he had to do. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, dialing the number for the local wildlife sanctuary. It was time to make sure Hope and Faith had a proper home. A home where they could grow up wild and free, just like their mother had intended. As he waited for the call to connect, he looked out over his land, the golden fields stretching as far as the eye could see, and he knew, deep in his heart, that the Carter farm would endure. Because some legacies aren't just passed down through blood, some are written in the stars. So what do you think? Would you have had the courage to trust a lioness with your future? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you loved this story, don't forget to like, share, and hit that subscribe button. There's plenty more where this came from. Until next time, take care, and remember, sometimes the most unexpected allies are the ones who save us in the end.